what I've been asked to talk about is friendship, and there's a lot to say about friendship. Eventually, we'll get to more of like the Christian end of it, but I think in order to really talk about friendship, you have to kind of approach it from a psychological angle at first, to an extent. But a little bit about myself. So I was born and raised in Jackson. I'm very much an introvert. So like when I was going through school, I only had just like a handful of friends that I actually ever really did anything with. And when I graduated from high school, it's not that I gave up on my friendships, but in all admission, like I really don't keep up with anyone that I went to school with. Like I see them every now and then, right? But my relationships in school were not strong enough that I felt any real interest in doing anything with them. I was very much a loner to an extent. And that was me in seminary for a good bit of time. It really wasn't until my 5th year in seminary that I really understood the true benefit of spiritual friendships and real friendships. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. But that sort of light bulb moment in my mind really changed a lot about who I am and how I minister now. So I think that's maybe to some extent why I'm qualified to talk about this. I've done a lot of reading about friendship, and I'm going to talk about those books in a second. But just to start really basic, right? So we all have childhood experiences of friendship, right? So maybe it starts as an imaginary friend. So like I had an imaginary friend in preschool, and the main reason I had an imaginary friend was because I didn't have friends, and my mom wanted to know who my friends were, and I didn't want to tell her I didn't have any friends. So when she found out, right, she told my preschool teacher that I didn't have any friends, and preschool teacher assigned me to a friend who became like my best friend all the way through 6th grade, because we were in the same school, and eventually we changed schools and didn't really keep up with each other. But either way, so his name was Eric, and Eric was my best friend all through elementary school, and I'm pretty sure I was his best friend. We were pretty much inseparable for a long time, right? But we all have experience of that, right? So we have an experience of having our first best friend. Psychologists tell us that usually happens around 4 to 6 years old. You pick someone who's your best friend. And what does that do for us, right? So it teaches us to have interest in the goods of other people, right? So when you have that first experience of a best friend, now as a kid, you're interested in this other kid also being happy, right? Which means that you start to become interested in the things that your other friend is interested in, right? Which is why it's no mistake that like your 4-year-old best friend ends up being like the person you're playing soccer with later on, is because you basically grow up and there's mutual interests, and you learn to be like one another. You start to take on each other's mannerisms, right, or your laughs or that kind of thing, right? So those experiences in childhood teach us, in a basic way, like it teaches us virtue, right? It teaches us to desire the good of another person, at least equal, if not higher than our own good. We also see like kids that are bullies in school, right? So what are bullies, right? So they're kids that don't do that, right? They see their own good as the only good, right? So friends teach us to desire another person's good. Bullies are teaching us to desire our own good, right? Well, eventually, as we mature, those friendships develop in like high school age into like teammates or people who are part of a club. And those relationships become a lot stronger because not only are you just doing something together that you enjoy, you're doing something together you enjoy in seeking a goal, right? Something that you don't already have, right? So you're trying to achieve something together. So now you're both desiring a mutual good, right? Something that neither of you can get to on your own. And you're building each other up in that, right? So especially like if you're on a team together, maybe you play different positions or whatever it is, right? So you're gonna reach that goal together, and you can't reach it alone, right? No one's gonna like win a baseball game by themselves. So like I was not an athlete at all at school. I'm still not an athlete. I'm totally uncoordinated. I can't do any of that. I was the president of the debate club of the speech and debate team at St. Joe in Madison. That was the thing that I did, right? So I was the total nerd in school. I was in the band. But so through that experience, right, the person that really sort of became my best friend was a girl that was on the team with me, who was also the other debate captain for the team. And she was so much better at all of it than I was. I think the only reason I was even in that position is because I was organized and could like type up lists. And she really just sort of had the mind, right? But we were able to work together and do well because of that, right? The team was doing well under our leadership because of that, right? So you build those relationships with your peers because you're trying to seek a common goal. High school students also usually build, in some way, like it's a different type of friendship, but they build friendships with teachers, with coaches, especially, right? So, those relationships sometimes persist, right? So maybe some of you had an experience of like you're in college and you'll reach back to a coach or a teacher like in high school because you respect their opinion, right? So you recognize a friendship exists even if it's different than the friendships you have with your peers, right? So those relationships develop as well. People also develop romantic interests in high school, right? So there's different types of relationships with different types of boundaries that all are expressions of different types of friendship, right? So what does this get to? Aristotle says there's 3 types of friendship, and they're all friendships that could be good. He says there's friendships of pleasure, there's friendships of utility, and there's friendships of the good. And Aristotle tells us that without friends, no one would choose to live, although he had all other goods, right? Without friends, no one would choose to live, although he had all other goods. So let's talk about those 3 types of friendships. So friendships of pleasure, like the name itself, it makes it sound like it's a bad thing, but in Aristotle's mind, it's not. So he says these friendships could be anywhere in your life, but they mostly exist for young people. They're friendships of people who have similar interests, right? So you do something together you enjoy, and so your friendships for as long as you enjoy that thing together, right? So you're on a team in school, you're friends for as long as you're on that team, and then you'll end up going to different colleges, and maybe you're still friends, but you don't really talk as much, and eventually the relationship sort of doesn't continue, right? Unless it becomes something else, it doesn't continue because the good you mutually sought no longer exists. That makes sense, right? So not necessarily a bad relationship, but they're not lasting relationships. They exist for a good for a time. Friendships of utility are similar. Aristotle says they exist more for older people, but I have seen them exist within high school and college age students as well. They're friendships that are based upon a need that someone has. So an example for an older person would be like you're in a nursing facility and they become friends with like their nurse, right? So it's not that they're using that person, but they exist in that relationship because they need them, in some way. That would be similar, I would say, in the relationship that a lot of students have with teachers and coaches, is they need that relationship because they're helping build them up, right? And they don't see them as using their coach or using their teacher. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. Obviously it could become a bad thing, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. But it exists so long as the relationship is necessary, right? So if you're in the hospital for 3 months, you become friends with your doctor, you're no longer sick, you leave, you may see them in the street, but you're not like calling them up like, hey, let's go hang out, right? That's not a relationship that really persists, right? So friendships of pleasure, friendships of utility. So Aristotle would say the highest form of friendship, right? Mind you, he's a pagan, right? But the highest form of friendship would be friendships of the good. And those are relationships which are solely based on the good of another person. So let's talk about that. So how do we recognize good friendships? So good friends seek the good of the other person. They desire time together with their friend just for the sake of that time together. That's something I think we don't really get anymore in our culture. Because nowadays, my phone's over there being recording. Nowadays we exist on like Snapchat and Instagram and everything else, right? And we continue our friendships through that, but we don't necessarily always have time together, right? It's a strange phenomenon that as we have become so deep in social media, people are really more distant than they ever were because we don't see a need to spend time with each other because we're talking, right? I've even noticed in my conversation, like I may say to someone, oh, I was just talking to them about this yesterday, and I think about, well, no, I wasn't, right? I was texting them or whatever it is, right? So I haven't seen them, I haven't heard their voice about it, right? So friends, real friends, need more than that, right? They realize that they need more than just like a social media relationship. They need time together, and not to accomplish anything, just like for the sake of what it is. It's sort of like art, right? Art is done really for the sake of art. I was talking to Father Mark last night about these paintings he has in his house of landscapes and sunsets, that kind of thing, right? Father Mark isn't amassing paintings because he wants to sell them, right? He's amassing paintings because he thinks they're beautiful and it exists for the sake of what it is, right? And that's how good friendships are, right? So they're not based on trying to accomplish a goal together, not based on, a particular need. It's based solely on we enjoy being together for the sake of that. You share emotional experiences in good relationships, good friendships, right? So Jordan Peterson talks about how you can tell a good friend by if you call them and give them bad news and they're actually upset about it, right? They don't respond and tell you about like a bad thing that happened to them 3 years ago, right? They want to listen to your bad news. Or if you call them in their good news, Jordan Peterson says they help you celebrate it. I think it's a great way to think about it. They help you celebrate that good news rather than not being totally excited or again telling you something good that happened to them, right? So like I get overly invested in my students in schools, right? So we just had graduation and I've been in Natchez for a year and I latch onto classes real quick, right? So the whole summer has been me like giving goodbye dinners to these kids because I'm gonna miss them. But also because like I wanna celebrate them, right? And so like I'm spending all my money buying them like Mexican food because I wanna celebrate these kids, right? But that's something that you should do. Like it's a gratuitous way, like there's nothing I wanna get out of this, right? I just want them to be happy, right? So that's good friendships. You can share those experiences. When I do marriage prep, I like to ask couples, not to like start arguments among them, but I like to ask couples, has anything ever happened to you that the other person got really upset about? Like you're in work and someone like upset you at work and you go home and you tell them and they get like super upset about it. And usually if the answer is yes, like, well, that's a good sign, right? If you can be angry when the other person gets hurt, like that's a sign that you're sharing that emotional experience, right? Does that make some sense? Right? So good friends are able to share that. They give without expecting repayment. That kind of makes sense, right? It's a Christian thing, but so obviously anything a good friend is going to give to the other, they're never expecting it to come back. They're giving it solely because they want the good of the other person, right? They encourage good habits and they discourage bad habits. Jordan Peterson used the language that they punish you when you do something bad, right? So what does that look like? Just like on a college campus, right? This would be applicability to here, right? So one example that I could think about is, right, so when a person's 21, they're able to drink, it's fine, but some people have like alcoholic tendencies, right? And they're trying to overcome that or that sort of thing, right? So if a friend realizes that another of their friends is struggling with something, they may withhold themselves from performing something like drinking or smoking or whatever it is for the sake of their other friend, right? They're not gonna do that around their friend because they don't wanna trip them up, if that makes sense, right? So that's a way of like encouraging good habits, right? Or if they realize someone's struggling with something and they see them fall, right? They're not gonna just like totally cut them off, but they're not gonna also avoid calling them out on it. So here's another example, right? So I've had experiences where like I've caught a friend, like in seminary, I had an experience where I caught a friend doing something that really is unbecoming of a seminarian, and that ate at me. But as a friend, I'm like, I have to address this, right? And I'll be honest, like it destroyed our relationship. Like it kind of fell apart after that moment. But I felt like if I was going to be a good friend, I couldn't just ignore the fact that he was doing this, right? So good friends are going to encourage good habits and discourage bad habits, right? And they're going to avoid things that may not be harmful to themselves, but could pose a threat to their friends. Good friends have total openness and mutual trust, right? So that people use like Planet Fitness is the judgment-free zone. That's how friends really should be, right? So they're totally open. They're able to talk about absolutely anything because they trust the other person's not going to go around and tell the whole town about it, right? So I think that was the moment when I was in seminary that I understood friendship. So here's like a story. So Father Mark didn't know me until my third year in seminary, and by then I was getting a little more open, but I still was pretty closed in. But at the end of my fourth year, I got invited to go on this beach trip with these guys, and now all of us are priests. We call ourselves the Beach Bums. We have a group chat that we go every year. We just finished like our 10th year doing this trip, right? But within that group, we have come to a level of total openness, right? So if we're struggling with something, the group knows about it. Which is helpful because we're all priests, right? So we all understand like the level that we should be on, like the standards we should be holding ourselves to. But we're also okay to just say like, I'm really struggling with X right now or whatever it is. And no one's gonna sit there and be like, well, this is awkward, or like they're gonna support one another. or right now, like one of our friends, his dad may not make it through the day. I was telling Father Mark about that yesterday, and they decided this morning they're going to pull him off the machines in the hospital, right? So we're all talking about that in our group chat because we want to support him through that experience, right? So friends are able to have that total openness, and I'm going to talk about that later on, especially with men. But that's one sign of a good friendship is when you know you can tell them anything and not be worried about them telling the whole town about it, and not worried about them judging you, but understanding that they're going to respond with whatever's in your best interest. And then the last thing Aristotle would say is that good friendships are mutual, though not necessarily equal. So what does it mean, right? So I talked about giving without expecting repayment, right? So maybe in a relationship, someone has more resources, whether it be money or a house or whatever, right? So obviously, right, this person may be capable of giving more, right? So we're not expecting a reciprocation in the relationship, but good friends do have a mutual response, right? So you can't maintain a good friendship if the other person isn't showing any sort of response to it. So maybe they can't respond in an equal way, but for instance, so like in some of my relationships, I like to spend time with people. Like I like to see people in person. Like I'll drive across the state to see people if I haven't seen them in a while. If the other person isn't reciprocating, like if they never call me and never want to see me, like that to me is a sign that, well, maybe it's not an authentic friendship, because they should desire in some way a reciprocity to want to see me. Like maybe they're not like me and are going to get in the car and drive 6 hours. Like that's crazy. I'm just a crazy person, right? But they should at least desire that. Does that make some sense, right? So it's not that it's an equal sharing, but there is a mutuality to it, right? So they seek the good of the other. They desire time together for its own sake. They share emotional experiences. They give without expecting repayment. They encourage good habits, discourage bad habits. They're totally open, and it's a mutual relationship, right? So that's Aristotle's signs of a good friendship. So what does it all have to say about Christianity? So in the church, we have an understanding of what we call spiritual friendship. So Edward Ravoux is like the granddaddy of spiritual friendships. He wrote this book, which is incredibly boring to read, but it will tell you all we need to know about spiritual friendships. I had to read this in seminary, and it sort of opened my mind to a lot of this. So Elred will take ideas from Aristotle, and he says that, okay, well, if friendships of the good, this highest form of friendship, right, if they desire the good of the other, what is the highest good? A person's highest good is holiness, is God. So a spiritual friendship, which Elred would say is the highest form of friendship, putting that over Aristotle's good friendships, spiritual friendships are going to desire the salvation of the other person. That's the highest good. Which means that when we're talking about encouraging good habits and discouraging bad habits, in this case, we're encouraging virtue and we're discouraging vice, right? So it's not just habits like I'm trying to lose weight, but it's habits like I'm trying not to be a glutton, right? See the slight distinction that's there. And when I talk about total openness, right? So now they're not just sharing like my dad's about to die. Now they're sharing like I'm really struggling with pornography or whatever it is. Like they're talking about sin, right? That's when you understand like you have a spiritual friendship. You're able to talk about something like that in a way that's open, judgment-free, and supportive. And they're forgiving. St. Thomas Aquinas says that there's nothing on earth more to be prized than true friendship. He even goes on to say that if Jesus, and I'll talk about this in a second, if Jesus is telling his apostles they're his friends and Jesus is love itself, Aquinas says that friendship must be love itself. Charity is friendship, says St. Thomas. So for Thomas, friendship is the highest ideal of earthly love. He actually says that marriage is just a type of friendship. Right? So I think one time, sometimes when we talk about friendships as the highest good, our mind immediately flips to marriage. But that it can exist even outside of marriage, right? Obviously, for most people who enter into the vocation of marriage, right, that will become a marital relationship. But they could exist outside of that, right? And married couples can have spiritual friendships with other people, right, that are chaste relationships. So Thomas would say that that's not something that's exclusive to marriage, but marriage can be and should be a type of spiritual friendship. So I already talked about in today's culture, right, social media has prevented us from developing this. But for men especially, what I've really seen is that virtuous friendships today are really discouraged in the culture, or they're seen as weird, right? So men have a hard time telling friends they love them. I don't know about any of you guys, but like, it took me a very long time to get to a point that I could tell a friend that I love them, right? And now, like, when I get to that point, like, I realize it's a good relationship. Like, I'm a person that once I'm really close to someone, like, if I'm not going to see them in a while, like, they're going to get a hug and I'm going to tell them I love them. It's the way it is, right? But that was not my experience, like, in high school. Like, that was not high school Aaron. That was not first 4 years of seminary Aaron. Like Mark would tell you, like, that was not me at all, right? But men have a hard time doing that, right? Because society discourages that, right? They might even, like, call guys names, like say they're gay or whatever it is if they're doing that sort of thing. But if men aren't able to get to that level, then masculine friendships end at drinking buddies, right? Which can be fun relationships, but are not going to be relationships of the good, right? They're not relationships that are building up virtue, that kind of thing, right? Maybe they're not, just totally terrible relationships, right? A lot of guys, aren't getting out, like, going to get plastered every single weekend with their buddies, right? But they're not trying to build virtue, right? They're just enjoying their time together, right? So they're relationships that are for pleasure, right? And potentially maybe in a good way, right? And a somewhat virtuous way, but they're not relationships that are just trying to build you up, right? So men have a hard time doing that. And part of the reason why is because men are not usually able to be vulnerable or open to their friends about what they're struggling with, right? So, like, for instance, today, right, for a guy to tell one of his friends that he's struggling with pornography is really difficult, right? I'm sure it's the same for girls, but I would say, like, for guys, like, that's something you just don't talk about, right? But if men are able to get to a point they're able to talk about that sort of thing, that's when they're able to truly start overcoming sin, building virtue, right? Iron sharpens iron is what the scripture says, right? The problem for women, right, is women mature at a faster rate than men. It's the way it is, right? I just had a conversation with a bunch of guys who were graduating, and some of them are dating girls right now, and I was like, you have to understand, like, this 18-year-old girl that you're dating is way ahead of you in maturity already, right? I told her, I was like, you're gonna go to college, and in her mind, if she's spending time with you and wanting to be around you and in college, her mind's already 4 years from now. You can't operate this relationship as if you're in high school just dating for fun, because she's not there anymore. You're just wasting her time if you're operating the right way, okay? So the problem is, because men are living in this immature state, right? Women, in order to become friends with men and enter into relationships, are having to basically lower themselves down to an immature state, right? So that partnered with the immoral culture we live in right now leads women to enter into romantic friendships that are not built on a good, right? They're just built on social pressure and a disordered desire for intimacy and friendship, right? So we all have a desire for intimacy. We're social creatures, right? Like, priests have that too, right? So we have a desire for strong friendships and strong relationships, right? We don't give that up when we become ordained. Everyone has that desire, right? But because men aren't being taught to have true friendships and no one's curbing their immoral tendencies, they're going to just spiral into sin. And women, in order to have relationships with them, are having to lower themselves down to that level as well, right? So one of the things I tell all of the girls at our school is, do not doubt the power you have, especially with men, to hold them to a higher standard, right? And I know that women struggle in the same way that men do, but women do have a power over men that they don't realize, I think, all the time. And you have an ability to help men get to that point. I've had conversations with women sometimes, like maybe they're struggling in marriage or whatever, and I'll tell them, like, do you think your husband has any, like, guy friends he ever talks about anything serious with, or he's just, like, go drinking with them, right? Because men need that. They need to have that outlet to iron sharpen iron, right, to build themselves up. You look at, a sort of metaphor, right? Why do men become so good friends on, like, a football team or a baseball team or whatever it is, right? Because they're having to force themselves to the point of literal pain to win, right? And they're doing that together. Once men get away from that, right? They're not in high school, they're not even a sports team anymore. If all they're doing with friends is drinking, right? And not forcing themselves to the point of literal or spiritual pain, they're not going to be built up. So women should encourage that. You should encourage them to have those sort of relationships. All of the great men and women of history had strong friendships that were built on the good, right? C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, one of the best relationships you can think about in history. You think about spiritual friendship. There's great movies that are out there. Like, they just made that movie about Tolkien. It actually doesn't even get to Lewis, but it's a great movie. Just to prepare for this, I watched a documentary on Lewis and Tolkien's relationship on the way up. It was really boring, but it had a lot of great information in it. Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, great friends. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, great friends, right? The people who built this country, they didn't do it alone, right? So we call it the founding fathers. It wasn't like just George Washington landed here and came up with the whole system, right? He had to have people to work with him. Jesus and the apostles, right? Think about friends in scripture. So David and Jonathan. Does anyone ever even know about David and Jonathan in the Old Testament, right? Excellent example of friendship, right? So King David, right, is anointed before Saul dies, right? And Saul is infinitely jealous of David. And David becomes really good friends with Saul's son, Jonathan. And when I say really good friends, like they have a covenant in blood. They consider each other brothers. They want to do everything with each other. Like David does that thing that I just said, right? David's always telling Jonathan how much he loves him. And at some point, Saul's trying to kill David, which is spiritually killing Jonathan because his dad's trying to kill his best friend. And eventually, at one point, so David gets married, and Saul tries to have David assassinated in his wedding chamber. Jonathan tries to save David. They're fleeing from town. They promise to always care for each other. And then when Jonathan leaves, he ends up getting killed. Right? So the last time Jonathan sees David is when he's trying to save him from his dad. Right? And Jonathan's death becomes a little bit of a linchpin for Saul because he's so upset about that, and David as well. But it's a great experience of a friendship where David and Jonathan are fighting terrible odds and they're supporting one another. It's a great example in scripture, right? Jesus and John, okay? Jesus dies at 33, right? John's the youngest apostle. They say he was probably in early 20s, right? So it's a good relationship and friendship, but you can also see how that relationship is demonstrating that friendships don't have to fall within categories of age or race or whatever it is, right? So good friendships don't even recognize that sort of thing. So good friendships can exist, for instance, like friendships with the good in an Aristotelian way. Like they can exist between a student and a teacher, right? A student and a coach. They probably don't exist that way in high school, but they can develop that way. Like age doesn't stop that. So Jesus and John. At the Last Supper, I mentioned this, right? So Jesus speaks to the 12 apostles and he tells them, you know, I call you my friends. I no longer call you slaves. I call you my friends, for I've told you everything the Father told me, right? So Jesus himself will frame his relationship with the apostles in terms of friendship. He wants them to think of themselves that way, to not think of themselves as co-workers, but to think of themselves as brothers, as friends. And the apostles then operated that way, right? So they operated as a body from henceforth. Anytime there was an issue in the Acts of the Apostles, they were confused about something, there wasn't like a lone ranger with this, right? They had to come together as a body of brothers, as friends, as a fraternity, and decide what they were going to do for the church. They operated that way, right? So, and sometimes that meant they had to discourage the bad practices of others, right? So when Peter and Paul are arguing over circumcision, right? They fought on that, right? So eventually they come together, they hash it out, and what happens is Paul's argument wins, and Peter goes out and tells everyone what they're going to do, right? We're going to take Paul's argument, and this is why, that kind of thing, right? So Peter's able to accept the wisdom of his friend and then hold on to it, and as a leader of the church, right, give it to everyone else, right? So the Lord wanted to frame everyone in that sort of thing. So how do we keep and maintain these relationships then? So I brought a bunch of books. This is a really great book for friendship. So it goes through 4 authors that speak about friendship. And one of them is sort of going to break it down. Aristotle is going to break it down into, there are 4 things that are necessary to maintain good friendships. And those things are effort, sympathy, trust, and faithfulness. Let's talk about that. So effort. So one of the things we'll see is that friendships require sort of delicacy. So I already mentioned like keeping in contact with your friends, being able to see friends in person. One of the ways you can ruin a friendship is by like a big blunder, like that can ruin it. But more commonly, friendships are ruined because there's not a desire to maintain the relationship, right? So, you know, you go off to a different school or you move across the country. If there's not an actual effort put forward to maintain the relationship, it's not going to last, right? So if we don't see our friendship as a duty, then it's not going to be maintained. So like think about it in marriage. You know, one of the things you see a lot, I'm sure Father Mark sees this, is marriage just can weaken when children come into play because mothers tend to start prioritizing children over the marriage themselves, right? Which is not that you shouldn't prioritize children, but you got to think, right? Your primary vocation in this situation is marriage, right? So when a woman starts prioritizing her kids over her husband, then her vocation is going to fall apart, right? Or if a woman starts prioritizing even going to daily mass over her marriage, her vocation's gonna fall apart because she's not putting the effort into it. You know, if a man is spending all his time at work or with his golfing buddies and never seeing his wife, he's not putting effort into the relationship, it's gonna fall apart, right? It doesn't just continue because it exists. So like anything else we do in life, like, you know, feeding your pet, right? You gotta feed a relationship for it to maintain. And you feed it with time together, essentially, communication, dialogue. How does that work with the spiritual life, right? You feed your spiritual life, your spiritual friendship with Christ with prayer, right? If you're not doing that, it doesn't exist, right? God wants you to have that relationship with him, but if you're not feeding it, it doesn't exist, right? You have to be able to have that mutual relationship with him. So effort. Sympathy. Okay, I talked about this a little bit already, right? So friends are able to sympathize with one another. There's a real and a genuine effort on the part of friends to understand each other. A real and genuine effort on the part of friends to understand each other. So maybe friendships don't always have the exact same interest, right? So as I've become older and I've made friends with people, somehow a lot of the people I've become friends with are athletes. And again, I've told you, like, I'm not athletic in any way, shape, or form. But like, I've become interested in all of this because they are, right? Like, I went to the College World Series this year, not really being an LSU fan, but because friends of mine wanted to go and they would enjoy it, and just because they wanted to go, like, I was excited to go and experience that relationship, and be excited about it, right, and get gear or whatever it is. Like, I'm gonna be excited about this because they are, right? So there's a sympathy, both in their emotions, but also in your mutual desires for like what you want to do for fun. Trust. So suspicion, that kills friendship. Think about that, right? So if you're ever suspicious of someone, right, you're gonna go home and question, like, well, why are they acting this way, or what do they think about this, or whatever. That will destroy a relationship. So the only way to curb that is to have total openness. So I tell my friends, particularly like if I'm coming down on them or something, like they've done something that they really shouldn't be doing, I tell them, like, if I ever say anything to you that upset you, I'd rather you tell me, even if you think I'm gonna get upset, then you just hold yourself back. Because at some point, right, we're gonna pick up that the other person's upset, and if we don't know why, we're gonna be spiraling in our own head trying to figure it out and probably throwing all kinds of things that doesn't work at the relationship, and those sort of things can destroy friendship. Suspicion kills relationships. Again, think about a marriage, right? If there's not total openness there, things are gonna fall apart. So an example there that I use with couples, you know, I don't think there's any ideal ways for couples to handle things like bank accounts, but I do find that couples that have separate accounts tend to be more suspicious than couples that have joint accounts, or at least some form of joint account. Just because at some point there becomes a question of, well, how much money do they really have in that account, or that kind of thing, right? If there's not a total openness, just the fact that you're suspicious, even if the other person hasn't done anything, just the fact that you're suspicious can kill a relationship. So mutual trust, total openness, that's the way you maintain it. And faithfulness. Faithfulness is the fruit of trust, right? So if you totally trust someone, you're gonna wanna stay with them and maintain that relationship. A friendship that begins with sentiment isn't gonna live and thrive on a sentiment, right? So you have a moment together where, like, y'all really enjoyed going out to eat or whatever it is, and you really enjoyed, like, let's say you go on a first date with someone and that was really great, right? That high you get from that first date is not gonna maintain the relationship, right? So like, I'm working with a couple right now that they're struggling with her parents, and they're dating right now, and I keep telling them, it's like, I'm not telling you that the parents need to love you, but if you can't be in a room with them, it's not gonna work, right? That's a hurdle you're gonna have to overcome, because just your sentiment of how you feel around here isn't enough to maintain the relationship. You're gonna have to overcome these other hurdles, right? So friendship requires some sort of faithfulness. If we never show our feelings to our friends, then what guarantee do we have that the friendship even exists? So like, one of the reasons I will tell friends that I love them is because I want them to know that, right? I want them to know that, like, if they're in a ditch somewhere at 3 a.m, they can call me because I love them enough that I'll drive 3 hours to go and get them out of the ditch or whatever it is, right? I want them to know that, even if, like, it's subconscious, right? We can't assume that people understand what we think about them. So we should tell them that. That just speech in itself will maintain the relationship and help build it up. And finally, the point that this author would say is that friendships can't be permanent unless they become spiritual. So the only permanent friendships are those that reach this level where they're seeking the ultimate good, seeking ultimately heaven, right? I'm not saying that your friendship is going to continue in the same way in heaven, but the only way that you can persist in a good relationship is if you're always seeking that highest good of friendship. So what does that look like with y'all, right? So obviously, right, you want to build up friendships within yourselves. Some of you are like rooming together, sharing houses together. But in your ministry to students on campus here, in my experience, one of the best ways, if not the best way, to bring people to Jesus is through friendship. Pope Francis calls it accompaniment, but I really think it's friendship. It's what it is. It's being able to get to know people, let them get to know you to the point that they want to spend time with you. And then slowly but surely, right, it almost sounds like it's a strategy, but slowly but surely you break down enough walls that you can then talk to them about Jesus. So the example I would use is like my past year in Natchez. So we, I get to school, I don't know anyone. Again, I am very much of an introvert, right? So I'm not the kind of person that's going to walk out and start to make friends with everyone. It's not me. I'm not going to shake your hand first. I wish I had that ability, but I don't. Either way, right? So we had a seminarian. He's a deacon now, Tristan, and he was going to get assigned to Natchez. And so I decided for March for Life in January, I wanted Tristan to come on a March for Life trip so that he could get to meet the kids because he's going to come back in August. He's there now. Well, Tristan is the opposite of me, right? Tristan is going to stand out on the curb after Mass and speak until like the sun sets down, and I'm going to leave. As soon as the last person like pulled him out of the door with a handshake, I'm back in the church, like, cause that's just the way I am. Like, I can't sit around and talk to people. But he's going to talk to them, right? So we're in DC, and we're like at a mall food court, and Tristan comes up to me and he's like, "Some of these kids want to become Catholic," and I was like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "Yeah, I just started asking them like if they want to become Catholic," and so. Sure enough, I go over and they're starting to talk to me about Catholicism randomly. And by the end of the year, we had 8 kids coming to the church, which is incredible, right? It just started with that conversation. And the way we maintained it is over the course of the year, rather than like putting them in a classroom, because I felt like they were in a classroom enough, we just did things like went to get Mexican and talk about Jesus, or even just small things, like just encouraging them in their sports or whatever they're doing. Getting them to the point that they realize that I care about them, that I want to build them up. That will open enough doors to then I can say, well, why aren't you at Mass on Sunday? How can we bring you to a better place that's here, right? That's the ability you can have with students here in the campus here, right? So one of the first goals, right, is to get them to Mass on Sunday, right? That's the first commandment. It's mortal sin to miss Mass. Jesus sent the apostles out 2 by 2, hopefully to bring people back, right? That's one of the things you can do. Go and just try to bring people with you. Bring your friends, even if you think they think you're weird or whatever for going to Mass. Like, bring your friends to Mass. Just see what can do, what can happen. Christ is going to work with that, right? If we give a little bit of effort in the form of friendship, in the form of love with people, just a little love to people, Christ is most definitely going to work with that and give us abundant fruit. So that's my comments on friendship. Do we have questions, comments?